The first additional speaker that we'll have for this panel is Dr. Norilmi Amilia Ismail, who is a lecturer, senior lecturer at the School of Aerospace Engineering at the Universiti Sains, Malaysia, and a founder of Space In, a spin-off company of the Universiti Sains, Malaysia. She graduated from aerospace engineering from the same university, USN, and got a master's degree in space mission design and a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Glasgow. She was the first president and founder of the Malaysia Space Initiative, which is an NGO for space enthusiasts in Malaysia. And in addition to that, as I said, she started a journey as an entrepreneur in 2020 when she created Space In, that produces pico satellites for IoT application. So Dr. Norilmi, thank you very much for being with us today. Our second panelist joining us, in addition to Dr. Sese and Dr. Ismail, is Mr. David Holichian, who served in the executive committee of the Singapore Space and Technology Association, SSTA, from 2018 and continued to be involved and affiliated with the Singapore Space and Technology Limited, which has been restructured from SSTA in 2020. David is called to the Singapore bar and is a practicing lawyer at an international law firm in Singapore. David graduated from University College London with a Bachelor of Laws, and he is an active contributor to journals and space policy related books and paper. David, thank you very much for joining us today. And last but not least, Mr. Maximilien Berthet from the University of Tokyo. He's currently a PhD student in aeronautics and astronautics. And he also served as the coordinator of a very important space capacity building project between the University of Tokyo and the Institute of Technology of Cambodia. And he's the leader of Toward Diversity, a student group to raise awareness on gender equality at the University of Tokyo. And as you may have noticed, he is also one of the lead major editor of the book that was published, and nothing would have been possible without the great and intensive work done by Max on this book. So I think let's remove the thumbnail and let's see all the panelists. And let's start directly actually with one question that is one question that was asked by Professor Kazuto Suzuki, who is one of our senior experts in space policy at the University of Tokyo, was how do you convince politicians that, oh, sorry, actually before that, introductory speech. I totally forgot about that. Yes, because, so as I said, the reason behind this, this session is to highlight some key lessons and key learnings from the book. And so here we have the major key authors of these chapters. And so I would like each of the new panelists who joined, so the keynote of Dr. Sese was mostly related to this chapter. And now I would like to ask first Dr. Norilmi, then David, and then Max to give us an idea of the chapters that you wrote. What are the key information you share in this chapter, the key lessons? So something like a 5 to 10 minutes introductory speech. So Dr. Norilmi will focus on Malaysia. David will focus on Singapore. And Max will do something a bit different because he will tell us about the countries that don't have an official space program yet. So as I briefly said in my introduction, you have roughly 6 countries having some form of, I would say, intense space activities, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore in a very special way. David will explain that. Thailand, Vietnam. But then you have countries that have no official space program, but that have some project or some initiatives that they want to start related to space, such as Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. And so Max will cover this, this category of countries having no official space program yet. So yes, sorry for missing this. So Dr. Norilmi, if you would like to start with your, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, I changed my mind. I have a slide, one slide at least to show so people will know what I'm talking about. Can you see?
Yes.
All right.
Can you try to put it in full screen?
Yep. All right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Norilmi. I'm from Universiti Sains, Malaysia. When I wrote this chapter, it was up to 2019, just before pandemic. So the landscape of the space industry in Malaysia actually have quite vibrant during the pandemics as compared before that. But you see that my chapter started with the history of the space activities in Malaysia. When I'm trying to get all the activities in Malaysia, I try to find the literatures of what we have before. It's actually difficult for me to get all the information in one place. So this is the best place, I think, when I wrote this chapter to write about how actually we start with these space activities in Malaysia. You see, in 1988, we have establishment of MACRES. MACRES is a remote sensing agency in Malaysia. And why we have this, actually, we have the social economics of Malaysia changed from independence to the 31st century towards 2020, which is parallel with the activities, space activities in Malaysia. So Malaysia actually focused on the economic resources, focus on the agriculture, natural resources, specifically on the oil and gas. And this is where remote sensing technology benefit on the management of resources and also the strategic planning for the country. And we see that there is a gap between 2009, 2018 here, where actually before 2009, just before, I think during the launch of Razak, before that, there's a lot of activity that be done by the country. And Malaysia actually was once a leader in the space industry in Asia, but it lost its momentum after Razak launch. There is a lot of things happen after the Razak launch, and there is a wrong perception of the public and push the government to actually move the focus not to the space industry to the other industry. Hence, we see a very slow development of the space industry in Malaysia between 2009 to 2018. But when we have the launch of UITM site in 2018, I think this is where we start the momentum again. And during that time, since then, there is a lot of positive development in space initiative in universities, in the small companies, and also NGO, which is revived the space industry in Malaysia. In this chapter also, I'm discussing on the motivation behind the space industry in Malaysia, why we have this. This is all about Malaysia 2020 visions, which is in the 6th Malaysia Plan in 1991, which is initiated by our previous Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. And one of the strategic challenge of the Vision 2020 was to establish scientifically advanced and progressive society, which can contribute to the scientific and technological civilizations. And on that time, space science was identified as one of the area that could accelerate the space technology and innovation. The reason why we have Baksa here in 1993, and along the way we can see that we have MISA. MISA is actually the merging between MACRES, the remote sensing agency, with Angkasa. And the establishment of the MISA, we hope that it can synergize and also can help to propel the industry, space industry in Malaysia. And this is, we see that we have this traditional space program, which is more on the government funded program. And you see here that starting 2020, during the pandemic, actually, there are more companies emerged from there. But this is not really covered in the chapter. I'm talk more about before that, 2019. But I just want to highlight that currently, Malaysia is picking up the momentum, and we hope that will be continuously vibrant industry in Malaysia. And I'm also looking on the area that we are working on the ecosystem, and we see on the upstream, downstream, and also on the educational side, and also non-formal space educations. And of course, all this is actually governed by the regulators, ministry, and also government agency. And when we talk about the upstream industry, in Malaysia, there's not so many players in the upstream industry before 2019. And we actually have one significant commercial company called Miasat, which is started in 1994, a long time ago. So we're already in commercial space industry before others actually jump into it. So we have Miasat for the communication and broadcasting services. Then during the pandemic, we see a few companies emerge, and is including Cyberdynamic, Angkasa X, Uzma, and other players. And the small startup also start, same as my startup in Space In, where actually all these players leverage on the new space economy, where they can do something to propel or to advance the space industry in Malaysia. But on the downstream side, actually, in Malaysia, we already have more than 20 companies in the downstream segment. And it covers on the EO, navigation, satellite, and also the communication, of course, Miasat, one of them. And when we see the budget for the Earth observation, actually, we have lots of budget put in this downstream. So by having a satellite program in Malaysia, actually, we have to look on the benefit of using taxpayer money, at the same time giving back the ROI, the return of investment, to the country. So the approach that taken by government nowadays actually quite different as a previous approach when we have Razak. And on the education and training, we actually have at least 3 universities that focus on the space engineering, which is producing the human capital for the space industry. And recently, one of the industry, the private industry, Angkasa X, working with University Sains Malaysia to have research center inside the campus, which is these actually something progress. We can see that we can see industry and university working together, but at the same time, they need government to work together with them, because the policy is still very important to ensure the sustainability of the business model that they're going to run for the industry. And we also have this non-formal space education where we have lots of private companies that working for the space education, like Apa di Langit, Generasi Maris, and other space educations and NGO. And this actually help to enhance or advancing the education on the space education in Malaysia and create awareness for the Malaysian citizen. And what is most important here that we are touched in this chapter is on the governmental policy and initiative, where we do have the space policy that started in 2017, and recently the space bill have been approved in Parliament. And from there, actually, we need to do something on that. And before this, we don't really see what the action by the government, what is the plan of the government to do something on the space program. But recently, MISA have introduced Malaysia's Space Exploration 2030 with the key objective to at least contribute 0.3% of the Malaysia GDP, and also to create 5,000 job opportunities in Malaysia. So we can see that this space exploration 2030 is like a blueprint for Malaysia to go back in the space race in Asians. So we really hope that there is synergy between government and also the industry and universities, so that with the strong ecosystem, we can do something to help this Malaysian Space Exploration 2030 success. And when I'm writing in this chapter, there's a few things that we are looking at. One of the is why the growth of the upstream company is not really as the downstream company. And one of them is because of financial backing. And with this current new space era, I think a more awareness has been created in Malaysia. Even the current for the space-in, we got a grant from the government, and it showed that space is actually now is one of the priority for the country to generate more income and to get more ROI from there. And also in this chapter, we have to look on the ecosystem, which is we need to improve more on the ecosystem. So there's more venture capital investment to fund the startup in the future, so we can accelerate the industry in Malaysia. And the space bill actually give a certainty on the legality to the space player. But what we are looking also, we hope that this government oversee on the bureaucracy, on procedures that maybe become a factor industry which is not involved or slowing down their space activities. And when I venture in entrepreneurship, I can see this, and we need to do something in terms of the bureaucracy and try to help in terms of policy to the industry, so that we can speed up, we're not slowing down to do our activities in this industry. And also before this, when I wrote this chapter, there is no clear program, but now at least we have Malaysia Space Exploration 2030 program, and soon government will announce in detail what they are going to do with this program. So hopefully there is something that we are looking forward and do, and will propel the industry in Malaysia. And finally, on the coordinations, we need very strong framework from the various ministry, agency, and industry, and also university. When we have this Space Act, actually under the Space Act, there is we form one bodies that have various of ministry, and we hope by having this, all the ministry can talk to others, all the agency, industry, and also university can be part in doing the policy or be part of the policy, so that all the input can be taken by the government. So we have really a good policy that benefit for everybody in the industry. I think that's all for my part.
Thank you very much. Yep. So now let's move to David for the case of Singapore, which is really unique and interesting in ASEAN. So you have the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Quentin. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be addressing you on this panel. My name is David, and as Quentin read, I am a practicing lawyer, so you might wonder why I am here. Well, I've been an observer of the ASEAN space in general, and learning from all the experts who are on this panel, most of whom are my friends of many years. And I also see many people in the audience who are also friends from many years. I think Quentin is right that the case of Singapore is pretty unique. It has no agency, it has no law, no specific space law. It has no central coordinating agency, and it has no specific space policy. So without all three, which Rogel correctly pointed out, are ingredients of a successful space program, despite the absence of all of that, Singapore emerges as probably one of the leaders in both established space industry players who have indigenous satellite capability, space startups sprouting up and able to attract funding, pretty sustainable research in universities, across both major universities, and a general ecosystem that has sort of acknowledged that space tech is a thing. I would not dare to venture into guessing why that is the case in the 5-minute speech. So maybe this is a promotion for the book. I also do not profess that you can find the answers in the book. So I'll just maybe sketch out some of the reasons why that might push things from the ground up and not impose too much from the top down. When I said that there is no coordinating agency, that is technically correct, because there is a EDB or STIN that does a bit of economic incentives. Well, I wouldn't say a bit, it's actually quite a lot. And you would trace through the history of EDB and see that they have released grants over the years. And I know that they're preparing for a new one coming up. So they've been giving economic incentives to try to encourage startups and industry to sprout. So I think that there has been some level of top down, but a lot of it is driven ground up. And the only way I can explain why that has been successful has to depend on other conditions in the Singapore context. Like, for example, a strong venture capital ecosystem that is actively looking out at potential opportunities. So startups here can get funded. Startups here are plugged into other networks as well. So major space startups, I would not name any, are getting in the funding from others outside of Singapore, not just in Singapore. They can depend on funding outside. So I think that is probably also something. The industry has been able to take a step-by-step approach, and I will characterize it as such, step-by-step, that they try to test out, accept, and then Telios 1, and then now Telios 2. If these make no sense to you, you might need to read the book. So then the step-by-step incremental approach has borne success because they are able to retain talent, and that there's a strategy basically that you can see, not just in the industry side, but now I go to the research and development in the university side. There is strong heritage in the universities, enviable heritage, I would say, in the region, in Asia Pacific, maybe aside from major spacefaring countries. And that heritage and tradition is retained, that knowledge and know-how is retained and built on step by step, so that researchers that are in universities can come out and find a lucrative job in industry. So I would attribute it to all of these very unique and advantageous, non-related to policy, law, or agency, really. It's just quite unique. And I think I would end my speech here without really answering any question at all. But maybe I've done a lot of plugging for the book, so Quentin, you can take note.
Thanks a lot. Great promotion. And I really want to emphasize one point when you mentioned university. And as a matter of fact, that is the element where Singapore may have similarities with other countries. The importance of universities in establishing, first in gathering capabilities, gathering capacity, and then retaining it. Because, and that's a topic I want to raise in the discussion later, but many countries are suffering from some form of government instability, whether it's institutional, whether it's related to the funding, to the long-term space development vision. And often universities are kind of safe haven where researchers with space-related knowledge can continue to live and have a job and keep the knowledge, so that when a program will be started later by the industry like Singapore or by the government like in other countries, then they can find people who can help, and they don't necessarily have to find the help from outside. But I don't want to take too much time from Max, who will mention the case of these other countries. And I'm really fascinated by this case. So what is happening in other countries that don't have a space program yet, that including some of them are least developed countries, this so-called category of least developed countries, such as Cambodia and Laos? Can this type of country even have space activities? So Max, you have the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Quentin, for the introduction. And yeah, it's really an honor for me to be here. Thank you, Quentin, for your leadership organizing this and in the book more generally. Of course, none of this would have been possible without you in so many ways. And it reminds me of Rogel's quote, if you want to go far, go together. And I think this is something that you really embraced in the book and gave me chances to explore some topics which are a little bit outside of my area of expertise at University of Turkey. And I'm really grateful for that. So yeah, I'll dive in now to the chapter. So we're talking about chapter 8, which is about the other countries in ASEAN, those which don't have a mature space program at present, but which have nevertheless some ingredients and have aspirations for that. So in this chapter, we wanted to achieve two things, basically. First of all, we want to provide a comprehensive overview of what is the state of space development in these 4 countries, so Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Brunei. And we also want to consider what are the common themes or cross-cutting issues which we identified and could potentially be relevant for other countries which are developing space programs. So those are the two kind of aspects which we explore in the chapter. And when we first were writing this chapter, we were thinking about calling it non-space actors and considering their space achievements. But we realized that actually, even though they're sometimes categorized as non-space actors, the meaning of non-space is very different in each of these countries. And in fact, there are some space activities. And so in order to explore what is non-space and what are the common themes, we adopted 2 approaches. The first is to provide a comprehensive review of space activities in each of these countries, and then to perform comparative analysis. So now I want to say a few words about, first of all, what space development is currently like in each of these countries, and what are the major themes we identified. So I'll start with the individual countries. So alphabetically, so first of all, Brunei. So Brunei has a prosperous economy, but it doesn't have a strong interest in developing a space program at present. But despite that, it still utilizes commercial space technologies provided by other countries. So Brunei is quite an interesting case. The next country is Cambodia. So as Quentin mentioned, this is a least developed country according to the United Nations Committee for Development Policy, same as Laos and Myanmar. And it's only just begun to invest in space technology. But despite this, the government has an interest in promoting space, but at present, there are no policies or agencies in charge of space in Cambodia. The next country is Laos, which is similar to Cambodia, but it has already launched a satellite, which was developed through a bilateral agreement with China. So it's also just started to develop some STI policy, science, technology, innovation policy, but implementation has proven more challenging. And finally, the last of these 4 countries is Myanmar, which by contrast with the other countries has quite a long history of space development actually, but it's only recently accelerated. And this is partly due to the creation of a national space development roadmap, which includes capacity building activities with Japan. Actually, Tohoku University and Hokkaido University, the same as were used in the Philippines for the PHL microsat program. So that's an interesting parallel, which we raise in the book. So the main message from these individual countries is that they have varied situations regarding their approaches to space development. And although they're labeled as non-space, typically, they in fact do have some interaction with space development. And so after this kind of detailed overview of each country, in the chapter, we look at cross-cutting themes. And in particular, we bring up 3 themes. The first is limited efficiency of government leadership for space development in these countries. In particular, what we mean by this is that the responsibilities for space development are typically fragmented between different agencies. So typically 3 types of agencies. The first is the Ministry of Science and Technology or equivalent, which is typically in charge of STI policy. The second type of institution is Ministry of the Environment, which is in charge, or equivalent, which is in charge of space data handling and management, especially for Earth observation. And finally, the third type of institution is the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications or equivalent, which is in charge of telecommunications licensing and frequency regulation. So because the responsibilities are typically divided between these agencies, it's quite challenging to develop long-term plans and strategic policies for space development. And this is one reason why building capacity for space has proven challenging in these countries. The second main theme we identify is about capacity building, which is typically conducted through collaboration between major space powers in the region, such as China, Japan, and India, and individual countries. So Rogel mentioned some examples of horizontal collaboration, but we still see that this kind of vertical collaboration remains one of the most dominant for these countries. So for example, 3 quick examples. So the first for China, for example, is collaboration with Cambodia and Laos to provide satellites through loan and bilateral agreements. So for example, the China Great Wall Industry Corporation signed agreements with Laos and Cambodia to develop their first satellites. Regarding Japan, for example, Japan has an agreement with the Myanmar Aerospace Engineering University to develop 2 microsatellites. And for India, for example, there's a memorandum of understanding with Brunei to develop space research, science, and technology applications. So those are three examples of how capacity building is being implemented in these 4 countries. And the last theme we identify in our chapter is the role of China. So China has exerted somewhat of a big influence in the story of space development in these 4 countries. For example, through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the framework within which the first satellites in Laos and potentially Cambodia will be developed. And in the book, we explore the relationship between, on one hand, potential geopolitical and economic motivations, and on the other hand, simply the pragmatic observation that these countries are very close to China. So of course, it makes sense for there to be some partnership. So that's basically all I wanted to say for this chapter. So in conclusion, in this chapter, we explore what is the meaning of non-space and what are the nuances of that. We have a look at how Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar in particular are developing space activities. And we look at some limitations and challenges on a government level for developing these activities. And in closing, I would like to echo what has been mentioned by Rogel and Dr. Ismail, which is that the story is changing very quickly throughout ASEAN, especially in these countries. So you should think of our book not as the whole story, but it's a snapshot at this point in time, and the story is continuing to change. So it's really exciting to be part of ASEAN space development at this time, and I hope you share our excitement, and I'm looking forward to what you think about our book during the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. It was quite a challenge to review 4 countries in 5 minutes, and you did it perfectly. So the way to proceed now is I would like, rather than asking precise questions, addressing some themes that you all highlighted at some point in your speech and that are very important in the ASEAN context. And for the first theme, I would like to rely on the question. So finally, I can come to this question that was sent by Professor Kazuto Suzuki, one of my colleagues at the University of Tokyo, on how to convince politicians that space is more important than other policy agenda. But I would like to reverse the question in a way by saying, how do you convince the people that space is important? And I know Rohel started to talk about that in his presentation. Because, except for Singapore again, but I'm sure David may have some interesting thought about that. So these are countries where there are important development challenges. And a question that is often asked, not only by people in these countries, but by many people attending the previous event that I organized is, aren't there other priorities than investing in space? And so I disagree with that, and I know you all also disagree with that, and you have good arguments for that. But so how do you convince the people that it is worth it for the government to invest in space, and that for the long-term development of the country, investing in some form of space technology, of course not going to Mars or the Moon, may have a direct impact on development and may be useful for the people? And in turn, if there is an interest of the people for that, then there is a political incentive to pursue that. And it may be a way to also convince politicians. That's how I link with the question. So to put it simply, how do you convince the people that it's worth it? And then how do you convince the politician to fund and authorize the programs? And I think maybe we can start with Norilmi. You are involved in a very important NGO that was actually co-founded by David, the Malaysia Space Initiative. So both of you, I would like to hear how do you engage with the government and how do you engage with the people, which is the important role of an NGO, and how do you convince them that space is useful for the country?
I can say it's very difficult. We doing this, I think, a long time ago, and when we have on the Razak side, then it's become worse. I can see that. The public perception on the space industry is not that good, but I think government, from the NGO point of view, we still need to educate and also create the awareness of the people, for the people on the how actually they are benefit from the technology. They don't really see that, even though they use the satellite technology every day. They don't really see that. So one of them is education. You have to tell them what actually this technology doing in your daily life. So be part of the education since they are in the secondary school or the primary school. They already know what actually they can be used for this satellite technology. We can't start from person who don't really. I think when we go for the education, it's good from the kids. And then when they grow, they have this in their mind that we have to have this satellite technology or any space technology. And to convince the politician is one thing also that we have to look for. But we have to remember that politicians keep changing. So the most important is how actually the agency, especially a space agency, bring this agenda. They need to really understand that they have to work on this and they have to work together with NGO and also in university to spread out about this awareness and how actually we can adopt the technology in the daily life. So recently we have flight in Malaysia, and people start looking at why we don't use satellite technology. And this is where we have to take a chance to educate people. And actually, this is not 1 or 2 days work. It's, I think, never-ending work. We have to create this awareness. So there's no best recipe to convince politicians or to convince people, but keep doing that and hopefully that they understand about this. I think David have something to say also.
No, I agree with all that. I agree with the question, Quentin. I agree with Professor Kazuto. But I offer a bit of a short answers. Yeah. Okay. So I have an inkling that when we ask that question, we already failed to answer. The Singapore experience at least tells me that if we need to convince people, then I think we are looking at the wrong thought process. Because in Singapore is almost reversed. First of all, as Quentin said, first you employ the universities. Universities need to do projects. They do space projects. After a while, they see that their technology can be commercialized. Either the professors go and do it, or someone else does it and becomes a company. Company gets funding, convinces the investors to put money into them. They grow big. Then they go to the government and say, hey, am I registering my satellite or not? Why are you not registering my satellite? Then there's a need for the government to take action. So I'm trying to challenge the orthodoxy of thinking, go and convince politicians, go and convince the public, and reverse it a little bit and do the things that then propel people to. So if there is a money incentive, then I think things will probably fall into place. So that is an undiplomatic answer to the question, but just offering a bit of a different perspective.
I think that's a really great answer that we don't often hear, but I fully agree with it. And I think Malaysia is also a good illustration of that. That the purely kind of government-driven convincing the politician to fund agency was not a success in the end, because there was political instability that led to institutional instability. And as Norilmi explained, the rebirth of their space program in Malaysia is because people reverse the approach and say, okay, let's show that we can do it. We can make startups, we can make businesses, and then the government gets interested. And that's why you have managed to accomplish. Go ahead, any thought on that?
Yeah, okay. I think for any country in the ASEAN, convincing people and politicians is always a challenge. That has been since time immemorial. We've been challenged. It's a challenge on convincing them that we need to venture into space development. But on the public side, space actually is one of the very few areas that is both inspirational and aspirational. And that is something that is unique to space. It's not something you can find in a lot of different fields of science. So this is something that needs to be harnessed. I think that would be the proper word. And this is where science communication actually comes in in great part. That you don't talk to people, or you don't talk to people who are already convinced. You talk to people who have no idea that space is actually pervading in their everyday life. And by making people realize that this is something that is already integrated into the fabric of society, then that's the time that they would realize that, okay, that we use space capabilities, we use space technology. It's just that we're not aware of it. And this is for this precise reason that in our space policy, we specifically stated space education and awareness, because we understood the necessity of having public awareness, because once you have public support, then that is the time that politicians will also become interested. And just recently here in the Philippines, because of the lot of news articles coming out about SpaceX and things like that, there have been quite a buzz in terms of having satellite technology for that. And then on the other hand, to answer Kazuto's question as well, how do you convince politicians that space is a more important policy? It's really not a more important policy. It's important policy. And the strategy, and this is probably tools of the trade that we learned in when we were lobbying, is that whenever we talk to politicians, we look at their profile first, and then look at which areas they are supporting or which advocacies they are supporting, and then try to understand, okay, how can space capabilities help support these kinds of advocacies that this particular politician. It's a lot of work, but then it really helps, and that by crafting the discussion into something that they themselves are pushing or advocating for, then that makes the whole job of convincing them very much much easier, because now they're just, oh, okay, this is how space technology can help in terms of disaster awareness, how it can help in terms of health and things like that. We use the same PowerPoint presentation. It's in the nuances of the discussion and talking to politicians that really changes the thing, and having the awareness on what are the different national priorities are also goes a long way, because at the end of the day, like in our case in the Philippines, the Congress, the senators and congressmen has the power of the purse. So they are in charge of the national budget. So it's really important that you would convince them that yes, having a space capability or space program is beneficial to the country. Not necessarily more important compared to other possible agendas, but it's something that can help support the different agendas of the government. So I think the key lies in that understanding that no, it's not just about space, but how it can provide a greater benefit to the more citizens of the country.
Thank you very much. And I would like to hear from Max a bit of promotion for the book. Chapter, is it 10 or 11? Chapter 10 is addressing this topic, how to connect space activities with the people in ASEAN, written by Max. So do you have any complementary thought to add to this?
Right, okay, thank you, Quentin, for this opportunity. Right, so chapter 10 is about how to establish connections between the public and space for sustainable development. So sustainable development in the sense to ensure that space activities can continue, and in addition to contribute to the sustainable development goals in some sense. And so this chapter explores some motivations for connecting space with the public and potential benefits. So I really agree with Dr. Sese that having discussion with the public is very important. And I guess the way the discussion is conducted is also important. So which channels to use and what representations of the public to incorporate into those channels. So for example, in Japan, historically, manga and anime have been used to popularize space culture, but these channels have often depicted men as the dominant role models, and they're present in all the manga, but women have not been featured as prominently. So this has contributed to a situation where in Japan, the space workforce is dominated by men. And so thinking about how to communicate with the public, what images to portray is something important as well that should be considered in outreach efforts. So that's something else I wanted to add. And then another aspect is how the public can directly participate in space activities. So of course, it's not possible for everyone to become a space engineer or a space lawyer or to be involved in the government, but there are still ways in which people can participate. And so considering the different ways is also important to democratize space even more. And to ensure that different people can express their concerns and ideas for space development. I guess this is especially relevant in ASEAN because there are many different cultural groups and languages. So it is quite challenging to ensure that everyone can be represented in some way in space activities. So this could be by choosing the name of a particular mission to reflect some heritage from a specific region, or it could be yeah, that's one example. But so representations of different cultures is something that should also be considered in space development efforts based on the analysis conducted in that chapter. So that's all I wanted to say for this chapter. And please have a read for more information. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so, because we have really short time left, but there are other important topics that you mentioned. So I want to go into something a bit more polemical. Geostrategic rivalries, China, Japan, India, or more China and all the others, to put it simply. How does it contribute to space development in ASEAN? To put it simply, is it beneficial or detrimental? Is it, these rivalries, are they kind of harming the abilities of ASEAN countries to develop a space program? Or does it allow ASEAN countries to kind of play multiple sides and benefit from this rivalry to get more support from each of these big players? You don't have to all to answer that. If anyone has thoughts about that, I can see Rogel is laughing, so I will force the answer to him.
Okay. I think in that aspect, because of the location of ASEAN, it's really in the nexus of several space, quote unquote, space powers. That's a term I don't want to use, but you have Japan, you have China, you have India a little bit further, and even Australia on the southern side, and on the eastern side you have the United States. And this makes ASEAN actually in a very unique role, that if the ASEAN countries would play their cards correctly, they can maximize the benefit by cooperating with each of these countries. Some cooperations will be limited to a particular sector, probably, but then it provides opportunity for cooperation with another country in another area. So there's no competing or no competition in that. And yes, it's the idea is to become for a country to really develop quickly and effectively in space. It's be friends to everyone. Of course, that also has to be done very carefully and diplomatically, to the point that you're not being influenced by external forces and affecting your own internal structure or internal governance in the country. So it has to be that's why having clear-cut programs and policies on the national level, knowing what your national interests are, like when it comes to space, is very important, so that you would know which particular interest or which particular area you would cooperate with another country. And I think there's opportunity for cooperation for all these different countries. Of course, outside of the realm of space, we have to look at the geopolitics, and there are other issues that sometimes comes into play, but then these are issues that can be addressed once it's properly analyzed and implemented as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, most of these countries established capacity building centers. So China and India both have important regional capacity building centers that are basically open to everyone. And I think if we look at countries, Thailand is probably the country that is the most talented at getting the best from all sides. So this is interesting how Thailand managed to balance, in particular, Japan and China, and receive important support from both countries. So I can feel that this is a bit sensitive topic. So let's move to something as important. I still believe that sometimes the rivalries between countries may be so strong that it could have an impact. Let's say US-China cooperation in space with one or the other may seriously hurt the chance of working with the other. But actually, what you said provided me with a good transition to what I was going to ask you, David, which is, so at ASEAN level, it seems that space cooperation from a government perspective is not a success. There are some platforms like the Subcommittee on Space Applications, but that frankly has very, very limited outcome. What is the status of ASEAN cooperation from the private sector side? Is the private sector also very much fragmented and, let's say, nationally oriented? Like you have Malaysian startups, Filipino startups, Vietnamese, Thai, or do you see some integration of the industry?
Okay, sorry, you again open up a can of worms here, so I'm going to try to keep things very short. First of all, I have before I answer your question, I have a big thought. That is, what is the point? What is the point of understanding the policy of all ASEAN countries? And to me, the answer has to be twofold. One is we are all ASEAN countries. Well, I think 3 of us here are ASEANites. Not to exclude you guys, but so to us, we are in a place in our history, we're in a stage of our history where our paths are more or less aligned. And it would be a pity if in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, we didn't all align on some norms and agree on some legal stuff, legal principles, policy norms that help us as a region become a cohesive 60 million population in the context of space technology industry. I think that would be a big pity for ASEANites, because we see advantages of that in Europe, we see advantages of that in other places. So if all of us just do our own thing, it is fine, but it's a pity. That's the main thing to me. The reason of understanding policy, it is to steer people together. That's number one. Number two, and that deals with the question cooperation. Why cooperation? Actually, it is to me my greatest insight of learning why cooperation is really finance-driven. Countries are committed to fund something together, and one country threatens to fall out. There is an inertia. There is a momentum to keep it together, just so that it is part of that line of alliance. So I think that to me is one of the greatest, to me, the point to sell cooperation. Now coming to the question, I'm so sorry to take up time. To me, the thing about cooperation from a top-down approach is going to be a bit hard unless we have strong will at the top to do it. And I'm not sure, based on my personal capacity, I can achieve that, but some of you may be able to. So to me, the greater, easier approach is probably ground up. And from where I see, from the place, from where I am, I have seen there have been corporations in Malaysia trying to invest in Singapore startups. There have been Singapore startups that have gone to Malaysia to try to launch test things. There have been Singapore startups that have gone to Malaysia to use the high altitude balloon experiments that we can do in Malaysia, but not so much in Singapore because of airspace. So thinking of it as a larger context, there must be overlapping opportunities for all countries. And I think that that is where we can see fruitful collaboration and cooperation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Max has something to add to this?
Thank you. Yeah, just a reaction to what David was saying. It seems that Singapore is quite good at promoting regional cooperation, if not on an industrial level, on a level of academia. For example, SSTL organizes the Singapore Space Challenge, and students from many different countries in ASEAN participate. So I'm curious whether you think a similar method could be used for business, or whether there are some other obstacles that should be considered. And yeah, I would like your reactions to that.
Oh no, I agree with you. Thanks, Max. That's correct. That is the sort of ground up that I'm thinking about. And yes, SSTL actually has an accelerator program that has seen startups from around the region participate too. So I think that you're right. That is the similar vein of thinking that we can explore.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I apologize for the poor time management. I would have liked to address many other topics, but I think through this last topic and the previous considerations on academia, one key element I think is important in ASEAN is the fact that, to come back on this issue of cooperation, cooperation is pragmatic in the sense that it is not government who cooperate just for cooperating or for advancing political goals. It's more, as David summarized perfectly, I need this, who has it? Who has the ability to help me or to enable me to do this type of activity? If it's a startup, I will work with a startup from Malaysia. If it's a university from Vietnam, I will work with this university from Vietnam. And I think that's really interesting. And you are all example of that. So Dr. Sese, by creating a new program at the Ateneo, the Davao University, Norilmi with the startup, Malaysia Space Initiative for both Norilmi and David, Max for initiating some partnership between University of Tokyo and the Institute of Technology of Cambodia, showing that even if the government is not necessarily doing its job, it doesn't matter. And you should not feel like you cannot achieve things. And that the kind of approach where you, typically based on what you see in the US, in France, in these historical space powers, where the government initiated everything and created the ecosystem. This often doesn't work like this in emerging space countries. Because as Rogel pointed out, it's not necessarily why it's difficult to convince politicians, because it's not a priority on the political agenda. And so instead, universities, startups, research institutes, often working all together, do the things and convince that things work. And if you have to work with neighbor, you work with a neighbor. If you can do it alone, you do it alone. It doesn't matter. And that thanks to this really bottom-up development of space activities in the region, that now ASEAN has a pretty vibrant community, mostly in the academia and the NGO and startups. And I think you all expressed that really well today. And so I would like to finish on these words and thank you for giving this overall picture of who is making this space activities in ASEAN. Because people should not misunderstand that ASEAN Space Program are GISDA, the Philippine Space Agency, the Malaysian Space Agency. In the end, most of the activities, they were important potentially in the past, but nowadays most of the activities, most of the successful activities are academia and the growing new space industry. So thank you very much for joining this event. I'm already sure that we'll organize another one with you because we could discuss this topic over many hours. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the attendees. We had a pretty large audience today, so I'm really glad for this first space policy seminar of the STIG program. So stay tuned on the STIG website. Also, upon registration, most of you may have agreed to receive news for future space policy seminars. So the next one will be coming up in the first week or the second week of March on rendezvous and proximity operation, on-orbit servicing, active debris removal, so very different kind of topic, more on space safety, sustainability, and security. But I hope that all of you and more will join. Again, thank you very much, and see you soon. Okay.